Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Baekdal Plus Podcast. In this episode, we are going to talk about 3 exciting things. First of all, we're going to talk about failed expectations. This topic came about because of a challenge that one of my readers asked me to do. I got an email saying, "This morning, when commuting to my company office in Lisbon, I was listening to a podcast and I thought it would be great if you would talk about your failures and your mistakes, things that you took for granted 3 to 4 years ago or more and that didn't evolve the way you believed or anticipated, and then discuss why it failed and how to think about that." Now, this is a great topic because obviously as an independent media company, I have made my share of mistakes, especially in the early years, and I've tried to do things that didn't work. I've made some assumptions that didn't pan out, and I have learned a lot from this over the years. Then, secondly, we will talk about the EU link tax. And really, publishers, you're doing this? You actually want to shoot yourself in the foot again? This is a topic that's just, frustrating because it doesn't make any sense. But let's have a discussion about it, and I will try to illustrate why I don't think this is such a good idea. Then finally, we're going to talk about Instagram TV, or what they call IGTV. This is an exciting new thing from Instagram, but we don't really know enough about it yet to really do any kind of deep analysis. But let's have a short discussion about whether this is something that's interesting for publishers to look into, and also just if this is going to be an important trend in the future. So let's get started. Let's start by talking about failed expectations and mistakes that I made earlier in the life of Baekdal Plus that didn't quite turn out the way I'd hoped. Now, obviously, as a media analyst, I spent an enormous amount of time making sure that this almost never happens. Because as an analyst, it's my job to be able to tell you what is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years so that you can design a strategy that would match it. And I have a pretty good track record when it comes to this. In fact, one of my personal definitions of success is that you, as a Plus subscriber, should be able to go back in time and read any article that I've written in the past, and the patterns and the trends and the strategies that I talk about in that article should also reflect how the world changed between when the article was written and what you see today. Obviously, I can't be 100% correct all the time, and I have made my share of mistakes where I assumed something to work in a certain way, but then it turned out that it didn't. And let me tell you about 4 different times where I had to completely rethink the way I was thinking about media. The first time was back in 2010 when I launched Baekdal Plus, and I made a pretty significant mistake in trying to judge how many subscribers I would actually get. Back in 2010, I had a fairly popular site, and what I did was that I covered many different aspects of trends. I talked about trends in relation to the media, in relation to brands, to design in general, and I even had a section that was just talking about future trends that wasn't really specific or defined, but just fancy concepts that might come in the future. Now, the problem was that the ad income was not really that good. With 1 million monthly visitors, I only made about $700, something like that. I can't remember the specific number anymore. It was a long time ago. But in any case, it was not a big amount of money. And it was nowhere near enough money for me to actually make a living from it. So I was looking at this and I was seeing how I had all these visitors and how I wasn't really making enough money from it. And I was thinking, what can I do to change that? And from me and from my perspective, the most promising future trends that I could see would be coming would be paid for media. Now, remember, this was back in 2010. And back then, paid for media was Well, there were a number of people who were talking about it, but no one was really doing it, and especially no one who was just an individual publisher like I was. So this was a pretty crazy idea. But as you can see today, the trend for paid-for media actually turned out to be true. What didn't turn out to be true was how easy it would be to actually get those subscribers. You see, back then, every single time there was a study about how many people who are likely to pay for content online, the result was always something like 5%. That was what the studies found. They asked people how many of you would be willing to pay for content online, and every single time about 5% would say, well, we will probably do it. So when you listen to media executives, or if you went to media seminars, everyone was saying that, 5% is the likely conversion rate that we could expect. Now, I looked at this and said, that's pretty amazing. If I have 1 million people coming to my site every single month, and 5% of those decide to subscribe, that is 50,000 subscribers. And if I can then get them to pay, $5 per month, that is $250,000. Now, for a big company like the New York Times, that doesn't necessarily sound like that much, but for me, as just an individual publisher, that was like just the most amazing gold mine of wonderfulness I've ever heard about. Now, obviously, I knew that I would not be able to get the same type of conversion rate that you could get, for instance, from the New York Times. So instead of 5%, I told myself I would probably only get 1% to subscribe to my site. And that was then the assumption that I made before I started Baekdal Plus, that I could probably get about 1% to subscribe. So that is about 10,000 subscribers, each paying about $5 per month, which was the price I had back then. So that would be 50,000 in revenue per month. That would be for one person, that's pretty cool, right? So I built Baekdal Plus. I launched it in December 2010, and then nothing happened. By the end of December, I had 3 subscribers. Not 10,000, just 3 people in total. And 3 months later, I had 29 subscribers. What was worse was that my subscription rate had already flattened out. So I was looking at a future where the total amount of subscribers by the end of the year would maybe be something like, 60 people at the most. Now this came as a complete and total shock to me because, I didn't get as many subscribers as if I was the New York Times, but still, we are talking about a conversion rate of 0.0000 something percent. It is, it was so low that it wasn't even funny. But more to the point, when you have 1 million people coming to your site and every single month only about 10 of them actually subscribe, you don't actually have a conversion rate. That's not a conversion rate, that's just accidental subscriptions. And this was one of the absolute first lessons that I had to learn about the media. So what went wrong? Well, today I know exactly what went wrong. And the problem was that I was still thinking about conversion rates the same way as you do it when you look at advertising. When you run an advertising-based site, you get traffic and you get exposure, and then on top of that, you get some kind of conversion rate, usually not that high, and the only really way you can make more money is to get more traffic. However, when you create a premium site, a subscription site, the amount of traffic you have no longer really defines your conversion rate. Instead, what defines it is intent. And that was the problem that I had. The 1 million monthly subscribers that I had all had the wrong intent. The main reason for that was because my old site was just too wide and too unfocused, so when people came to my site, there was nothing really specific that would cause them to subscribe, because it was just random articles for random people. This was the problem that I had to fix. I had to change my entire mindset from being traffic and exposure based to becoming intent and focus based. And if you look at how Baekdal Plus has changed over the years, you will see that I have completely redefined what Baekdal Plus is. In the early days, Baekdal Plus was just, slightly longer articles, but with the same lack of real focus than before. Whereas what I do today is very, very specifically focused on creating media reports for media executives about very, very specific elements of media. So this is the first key lesson that I had to learn, and I hope you'll learn something from that. If you want to focus on subscription-based media, traffic is now secondary to intent. And it's really intent that defines everything. And it's not just the intent of your audience, it's also the intent that you have as a publisher. If you want to get people to subscribe, you need to think about it as a product. And you need to create an environment for people where needing that product is essential to why they're coming to your site. The second time that I made an assumption that didn't turn out the way I had hoped was when I was trying to do the freemium model. Like most people in the media industry, I once believed that the freemium model was the best way to drive subscriptions. And the way this works is that you write a lot of free content, which you then use to drive in the traffic, and then you use that traffic to drive subscriptions. And this was also what my original strategy was about. My original strategy was that I would write a lot of free articles, which would bring in a lot of traffic, and then I would promote my Plus articles in the sidebar and the bottom of those articles so that people would then see the Plus articles and then hopefully subscribe. However, this didn't turn out that way. What happened instead was that the free article actually had a negative impact on my subscription rate. The way this happened was that the more free articles I wrote, the more traffic I would get, but also the lower the subscription rate I would get. And it actually turned out to be a lower subscription rate than if I didn't write any free articles at all. Now, this is a crazy thing to realize because every one of us has been taught to believe that freemium is a really cool model and it's the way you get people in. But what I learned was that it's not. Free content is only good at driving more free traffic. It is not very good at driving premium traffic. So when I looked at my analytics, I could very clearly see that the free traffic was driving in more free traffic. But when I looked at my Plus traffic, most of that traffic only came because of other Plus traffic. In other words, the premium traffic was driving the premium traffic and the free traffic was driving the free traffic. And if I made too much free traffic, the premium traffic would be drowned out and not get the right amount of attention. So I had to completely change my frame of mind around how I was doing that. Today, I no longer consider free traffic to be relevant in creating more subscribers. And I completely changed my publication schedule to not consider free traffic as important at all. So if you look at my publication schedule today, you would see that my Plus article takes the top spot, meaning that I will start out by writing my Plus articles first, and only then when I'm finished with that, I might consider also writing a free article. But if for some reason I don't have time for that, I will simply skip the free article and then instead start to write another Plus article, not the free articles. So this was a pretty big thing to realize because I had to completely change my publication schedule. The third thing that has caused me to somewhat dramatically change the way I think about things relates to sharing. Now, this one isn't really a failed expectation as such. It's more of a changed expectation. So in the early days, sharing was something that was really, really important. And we could all see how social channels were driving a tremendous amount of effect for all of us. This was true for anyone else, and it was also true here on this side. In fact, when I built Baekdal Plus, I made sure that sharing was a really critical element of it. Now, today, because of social algorithms and because of just the way that social channels put things together, we don't get the same type of sharing effect anymore. Specifically, sharing by itself has become more or less meaningless, and I can see this today on my side. It doesn't really matter today whether people just share an article or not. I mean, don't get me wrong, please do share all my articles, but what matters is how it is shared. If you're just sharing a link, it doesn't really have any impact because people see so many different things, and the way we connect with social channels today isn't really a real connection. But if you instead share something specific where you are pointing out why something is useful for people, then that type of sharing has an effect. And this is the difference between the old days and what we have today. Today, sharing doesn't really work just by itself. It's only when you get true word of mouth that you actually get an impact. So one of the things that I have changed, and one of the places where my expectations towards things has changed, is in relation to sharing. I don't really pay much attention to just social sharing anymore. It doesn't really have any kind of impact. But what I do pay attention to is, how do people feel towards my content? How useful is it what I do to you? Because that word of mouth that then happens, which can happen in any way. It can happen in terms of sharing. It can happen in just an email. It can be a recommendation that one person is having a discussion one evening with another person, and he mentions that, hey, this Baekdal guy is someone that you should look into. That type of sharing is very valuable. But that is a very different form of sharing than just social sharing. So things like having social widgets on my site where I encourage people to say, share this on Twitter or like this on Facebook, I don't really care about that anymore. But I care a lot about making sure that every single thing I do is something that people would want to share in the form of word of mouth. I don't care about sharing, but I care about word of mouth. So that is the third element where we have seen a somewhat big change in the way things work over the past couple of years. The final element I want to talk about in terms of failed expectation relates to just statistics in general. Now, in the early days of just doing Baekdal Plus and all the other things I did, I looked at statistics in much of the same way as everyone else is looking at it. That means that you set up a dashboard and you fill it with all these different forms of analytics that you're used to. And then you check those statistics every now and then. And if you're really fancy, you start to do some custom reporting and some other things. One of the things that I discovered when creating a subscription-based site was that pretty much every single standard metric that you see in your analytics doesn't really reflect on anything that relates to subscriptions. So just to give you a simple example, take something like bounce rates. If you are running an advertising-based site, or if you're running an e-commerce site, bounce rate is something that is really important because it can tell you a lot about the effects of the activity that has happened on your site. But in terms of subscriptions, it doesn't really have any impact. I can see this every single day. If I look at how my subscribers are using my site and reading my articles, there is no discernible pattern between a certain type of bounce rate and the loyalty or the renewal rate of a subscriber. So I don't really care about bounce rates anymore. In fact, I don't even know what my bounce rate is right now. I think it has been at least 6 months or so since the last time I checked my bounce rate. It simply doesn't matter whether a person coming to my site reads just one article per visit or whether they read 2 or 4 or 10. It doesn't matter. Because in terms of subscription, it's not about what people do per visit. It's about what people do as a whole over a much, much longer period of time. So how people react over a 6-month period is far more important than how people react over a single visit. And this is the problem that we generally have with analytics. It is very focused on things that just happens at the moment or, last week or today or whatever, instead of what you call the lifetime value of your audience. And for subscription, the lifetime value, or more to the point, the lifetime loyalty, is far more important than any of these other metrics. This also includes other metrics like page views and, basically just every single standard metric that you see in your analytics program. Doesn't really matter what those are because the important metrics is something else. What I look at is, first of all, a much higher level of analytics where I look at actual results. This could be how many people who signed up for a free trial following the publication of, for instance, a new Plus article. That is a really important metric. It's the same thing with what I talked about before in terms of sharing. One of the ways that I could see that sharing wasn't as important anymore was because when I just looked at social sharing, I could see that it didn't really have an impact on the number of free trials or the subscription rate or anything like that. But when I looked at word of mouth, where people would have done something that was more than just sharing, that was when I saw the real effect. So analytics in general is something I would call a failed expectation, because it's something that we used to look at in a certain way and we expected a certain outcome because of it. But when you run a subscription-based site, it doesn't really work that way. And you have to really rethink the way you look at analytics. And you have to think about it in terms of measuring things like momentum rather than views. So this has been a really big change for me, not just in terms of what I do on my own site, but also in terms of how I analyze everything else that happens in the media world. I don't really care how many views someone has. What I care about is how much momentum you have. And this is something that's definitely worth thinking about. What are you doing with your analytics today? Are you still just looking at bounce rates and views and page views and all those other standard metrics? Or are you looking at the momentum of your audience? So these were the 4 examples I had for you in terms of failed expectations, and I hope they are useful to you. One of the important things to remember is that what I do on Baekdal Plus is not necessarily the same as what you do in your publication. My audience is focused on a very high-end type of business analysis, and most of the people who read Baekdal Plus are business executives. This audience has a different pattern than if, say, you were a lifestyle magazine. So always remember that different publications will always have a different consumption pattern. But enough about this. Let's talk about the link tax.
It's going round in circles. 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 It's going round in circles.
I think the best way to go about this is to divide up this topic about a link tax into 3 parts. First, we will talk about what actually happened and what it is that this directive actually says. And then we're going to talk about the exceptions that are in this directive. And finally, we will talk about the economics of it. The first thing to understand about this whole thing is that nothing has actually happened yet. There is no link tax law or anything in place in the EU yet. You see, what we're talking about here is an EU directive. And the EU directive is not a law. It's simply a way for EU to tell its member states that they should look into this and turn it into a law. But now it's up to the member states to look at this directive and try to interpret it and try to either incorporate it into existing laws or to create new laws, or there are about 1 million different things that may happen or may not happen. So nothing as of yet has happened. But more to the point, what this directive says isn't actually anything new. So let's talk about what's actually in it. The directive itself deals mostly with copyright, but the part about it that is relevant to us is Article 11. Now that article deals with the protection of press publications concerning digital users. And it has 3 parts. The first part is the rights that it grants. The second part is about the exceptions. And the third part is a time limit of 20 years, meaning that anything that is older than 20 years does not apply. So what are the rights that it says that we suddenly get? How does this turn into a link tax? Well, it's because of that first part, which says, member states shall provide publishers of press publications with the rights provided for in Article 2 and Article 3 of Directive 2001/29/EC for the digital use of their press publications. That's it. That's all that's in this directive. It's merely pointing to another directive from 2001, and then it says this should apply here. So nothing new has happened. It's simply just referring to an old directive and saying, let's try it again. So you ask, what is this Article 2 and Article 3 that it refers to from this old directive from 2001? Well, Article 2 talks about the reproduction rights, where it says that member states shall provide for the exclusive right to authorize or prohibit direct or indirect, temporary or permanent reproduction by any means or in any form, in whole or in part. Or in simple terms, what it says is that it's up to the creator to decide what happens to that content. Not just in full, but every single aspect of it. Okay, so as a publisher myself, I don't necessarily disagree with this. I mean, when I write a PLOS report, I want to be in charge of what happens to that PLOS report. I want to be able to say that nobody has the right to reproduce it in any way and other things like that. I mean, the idea that a creator is in control of what that person creates is basically a very sensible thing to say. So in principle, I actually agree with this. I agree that the creator should be in control of what they create. And if anyone else wants to reproduce this, then they have to ask the creator about it, and then they have to come to some kind of agreement about how to make that happen. I think, generally speaking, that is a good way to think about it. The problem here is that this regulation was created back in 2001, before we really understood what the internet was. And back then, people didn't really understand all the nuances of what we see today. So when they talk about reproduction either in full or in part, what does that actually mean? Well, the problem is this new directive doesn't say. It only refers to this old directive, which also doesn't say. So nothing has been solved yet. This age-old question of whether a link is actually a reproduction or not has not been solved. Because is a link a reproduction? Is a quote a reproduction? Is a paraphrase where you take information from a site and then paraphrase it into some new words, even though all the information is the same? Is that a reproduction? It doesn't say. So it's just a complete mess. We haven't actually solved any problems. What it does instead is it just gives publishers, free right to define this for themselves. But that is the same thing that we tried to do in 2001, and it didn't work back then. So why would that work now? It's just a complete waste of time, and I don't really understand why anyone would think this is a good idea. I mean, what we really need to do is we need to have a serious discussion about all the different aspects of how the internet actually works. And we can't do that by just referring to something from 2001 before all the things that we see today was even invented. This leads us to the second part, which is the part about the exceptions. Now, the exceptions refer to the same old 2001 regulation, in this case Article 5. And Article 5 deals with exceptions and limitations. And there is a very long list of exceptions for, if it's used for lawful use, or if it's just a transmission of data between third parties, or, if it's used for scientific purposes, or if it's used for private use, then all of that is an exception. But then as you scroll down the page, you get to reproduction by the press. And what that says is that the press is an exception. Or in other words, none of this applies to the press. It only applies to when other people do things. So if Google uses a snippet from a newspaper, then this law applies to Google. But if a newspaper uses a snippet from somewhere else, then this law does not apply to the newspaper. That's what this says. And it's just completely ridiculous, because if we were to create a link tax, then obviously it must apply equally to all. I mean, we can't create a regulation that says everyone else but the press should pay for the content that they use. That's ridiculous. I mean, I know that there are a lot of journalists and publishers out there who actually think this way, but I'm sorry, this is not the world that we live in anymore. Just to give you one example between now and then. Back in 2001, there was a very clear distinction between what we did in the press and what everyone else did. So if you had a scientist writing a document, then the scientist was not considered to be the press. That was just a person creating something, and in the press, we then reported on it. But if you look at the media landscape today, this is no longer the case. Take something like a YouTuber. Every single time a YouTuber creates a video, that video is not just a creation, it's also part of a publication. So a YouTuber is now also the press. And so is everyone else. When I write an article for my site, I'm also the press. So this whole idea of distinguishing between the press as one thing and everyone else as something else, and then making an exception that this doesn't apply to the press, but it does apply to everyone else, it just doesn't make sense in 2018. It's a concept from a world before the internet. What is even a bigger problem is how ridiculous this whole thing is. Because what the press is saying is nobody else should be allowed to use snippets or link to us or in any way use our content without our permission and without some kind of licensing deal. But in the press, we should be allowed to do all of those things without any formal limitations. And we see this every single day. Right now in front of me, I have an article from one of the largest newspapers in my country. And when I scroll down that page, I can see that they are referring to things that was reported in the New York Times, and then 2 paragraphs later, they refer to something that was reported in CNN. So this newspaper is using snippets after snippets after snippets from other newspapers. And you are now saying with this directive that you should be completely free to do this, but nobody else should be allowed to do the same. I'm sorry, I can't agree to that. This is the most ridiculous thing anyone can ever say. It's just completely absurd, and it illustrates a level of elitism in the media that we simply don't have a right to have. So, as I said before, I don't really disagree with the overall concept of this. I'm a creator myself, and as a creator, I very strongly believe that I should be in control of what I create, which includes being in control over how other people can use it. So if I write an article and I put it up on my website and I then say it should only be available on my website, then that should be completely up to me to decide. But that's not really what we're talking about here, because the problem is that we are talking about a link tax, and this doesn't define it. Nothing in this regulation is actually talking about links. It's only talking about reproduction in whole or in part. And it talks about this in a way that is about 20 years out of date. So what we need is an entirely different discussion around this, because I agree that there are some fundamental problems that we need to solve, but none of this actually solves it. This leads us to the third and final point about this, which is the economics. Because one of the main reasons I hear publishers talk about this is because they think they can use this to get Google or Facebook to pay them. The problem is that this doesn't actually make any sense, because when you calculate how much money each publisher would actually be able to make, the result is always such a low amount of money that it's not even funny. But I want to give an example of this. So let's do a simple calculation of how much money you could earn as a publisher if Facebook were to do the same kind of revenue sharing that we see on YouTube. So the first thing is that we need a baseline, which is how much money do Facebook actually makes per user per month. And we can simply look up that number in Facebook's financial reports, and the answer for the European market is about $2. Okay, so these $2 is the average revenue per user as a whole. So the next thing we must do is we must look at how big a share of that relates to the media. And we also know the answer to that, because Facebook has told us that only 4% of the Facebook newsfeed is media related. So to calculate the share of the revenue that is caused by the media, we simply take 4% of $2, and the result is $0.08. That is how much revenue that we in the media is generating for Facebook per user per month. Now what we can now do is two different things. We can either calculate the total revenue that the media would then earn, or we can calculate it per publication. Let's do both things. First of all, to calculate the total revenue that the media in Europe is generating for Facebook, we simply take the 4% of $2 and multiply that with all Facebook users in Europe, and the result is $16.6 million. That's it. This is the total revenue that the European news market is generating for Facebook. Now, granted, 16 million is a lot of money, but remember, this is for every single European publisher combined. So how much money would a single publication be able to earn from a Facebook link tax? Well, to calculate that, we need to look at some other factors. First of all, we have to ask how many different publications do a single person see over a period of a month in their newsfeed. What we are talking about here is not just the publications that people have chosen to follow or even the publication that people click on. We are talking about of all the links that happens to show up in their newsfeed, how many different publications would that be? Now, I don't really have a good number for this, so we have to estimate it. And I try to look at different things, and I would estimate it to be something like maybe 150. So we take the $2 that Facebook makes per user, we take 4% of that to get the revenue that we generate in the media, and then we divide that by 150. This leaves us with $0.0005 per user per publication. But we're not done yet. You see, in Europe, we have a language barrier. The problem is that people in Europe don't just see local media. Let me give you a simple example. If you take a person from Sweden and you look at their Facebook feed, what you'll find is that they are seeing a mix of Swedish and non-Swedish publications. But if you instead go to a place like the UK and you look at their Facebook feed, then almost every single thing in their Facebook feed will be based on English, and it's highly unlikely that they are going to see anything from Sweden. So Swedish publishers are at a massive disadvantage simply because of the language barrier. People from Sweden will see information from publications from other places, but people from outside of Sweden don't go to Sweden to read Swedish news. How many views do you lose because of this language barrier? Well, obviously that's going to be different from every single country, but let's say it's 50-50. So Swedish publications are going to lose half the revenue share simply because people don't just spend their time with Swedish news. This means that the revenue generated on Facebook per user is now down to 0.00027 that a Swedish publication would be responsible for. So the last step is to do a revenue share. And let's see if we do the same revenue share as what we see on YouTube. So 55-45. In other words, you as a publisher will get 55% of the revenue, whereas Facebook will keep 45%. The result of this is that the revenue per user per month to a single Swedish publication would amount to $0.00015. Okay, so that is per user. So in order to calculate how much money a single publisher would actually make for all the users, we simply multiply that by the number of active Facebook users in Sweden. And right now, that number is about 5.2 million users. So we take 0.00015, multiply that by 5.2 million users, and the result is $770 per month. That's it. That's all you can make. So I don't even understand why we keep having this discussion about a link tax, because there is no money in it. Now, as I said before, I do think there are some genuine concerns that we need to address in the industry. But talking about this in terms of a link tax is just completely ridiculous. Now, I know that some of you would then say, but this is not the point. The point is not how much money we actually make. The point is that we should be able to demand a price. The problem is that this is never going to happen. Because if you as a publication only generate $770 for Facebook, why would Facebook then suddenly be willing to pay something like 10 times or maybe even 100 times more than that? This is just never going to happen. So my advice to publishers is to just forget the link tax. Let's discuss the other things about this. But the concept of the link tax, that just has to die. It's such a waste of time that keeps us away from doing other things that are far more valuable. So that's my view on this. You might disagree, I don't know, but I just don't see why we keep having this discussion.
It's going around in circles.
Now, finally, let's talk about something a bit more exciting. Let's talk about the new Instagram TV. As I said in the beginning, this is going to be very short because we don't actually know anything yet, but several of my subscribers asked me to talk about it. So here is the very, very quick version of whether this is something that is worth paying attention to or not. First of all, if you haven't heard about it, Instagram has launched a new video channel for long-form video called Instagram TV, or IGTV as they call it. It's a separate app and the videos are all vertical. Now, right now, most of the videos that you can find on this service are ultra short, but the idea that Instagram is trying to push is to get creators to create videos up to an hour long. This is actually quite interesting, and I've heard from several of my friends who are YouTubers that Instagram TV might be another channel they need to look into. Now, there are a lot of things that we just don't know yet, and it is very, very early for us to really judge whether this is going to be a new thing or not. As a media analyst, I like to explain to you how I look at this. Whenever I hear about a new service like this, I have 3 key elements that I look for. The first thing is whether you can really connect with the people you follow. This is one of the biggest obstacles, for instance, we see on Facebook. Because of the Facebook newsfeed, you never really connect with anyone because it's the newsfeed that decides what you're going to see and when you're going to see it. This is not going to work for a long-form video service. So in order for Instagram TV to work, it needs to be designed to create actual real connections between the channels that create the videos and the people who watch them. If you don't have a real connection, it's just going to be another random social channel. And from a publisher perspective, it's just going to be another marketing channel. So the real connection is absolutely critical. Now, for Instagram TV, right now, they have the potential to create real connection because you can kind of follow people specifically. And as part of the app, there is a section, just like on the YouTube app, where you can see just the people that you follow. But it is also designed to just show you a lot of random things. So right now, whether Instagram is going to be a good place to actually connect with things that you care about is not exactly clear. There's the potential for it, but we don't really know if it's going to happen yet. The second thing is that a long-form channel must create macro moments. Again, this is one of the key problems that we have on Facebook. Everything you do on Facebook is a low-intent micro moment, and because of that, you never really feel any loyalty to anything you see. But if you are going to upload long-form video and actually create an audience, you need to have macro moments. So will Instagram be a good place for a macro moment? Well, right now, I don't really know. Personally, I think one of the key problems is the vertical video format on a mobile phone. I know that some young people might not see that as a problem, but there's a reason why you don't watch Games of Thrones on your phone, because that format and that consumption mode doesn't really work for long-form content. So again, there is the potential here because Instagram is really trying to do it, but we don't really know yet if it's actually going to work. The final element is monetization. One of the key reasons why YouTube and Twitch is so dominating in the long-form space is because they have found a way to monetize creators. So the only way for Instagram TV to be a success is if they find a way to truly monetize the creators on it. Now, Instagram is saying that they are planning to work on this after they have launched the app. So at some point in the future, they will try to figure out how to monetize it, and maybe at that point, we will see something interesting. But right now, Instagram TV is solely a marketing channel because you can't make any money from it. So monetization on these channels is something that is really, really important. And these are the 3 elements. It needs to create a connection, it needs to be a macro moment, and it needs to be monetized. And right now, there is the potential for all of them. And it looks very exciting. The app works fairly well. And I know several YouTubers who have expressed some interest in it. But we are very, very far from actually knowing whether this is going to be interesting or not. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical because Instagram is owned by Facebook and it's pretty clear they don't really have the right mindset for creating long-form content. They are very good at creating social engagement. They're very good at creating micro moments. But nothing that Facebook has done yet has shown any resemblance to what you would find on, say, YouTube, or even better, maybe on Netflix. And that's really where Instagram needs to look. They should not just be another social video site, because we really don't need another one of those. So what they need to figure out is how to create monetizable macro moments. This is definitely interesting. I will keep Instagram TV on my watch list or things that I have to pay very close attention to. But as of yet, there is nothing really to talk about. But maybe in 6 months' time, we will see something interesting. And that's when we can start to talk about strategies, and we can maybe talk about some of the nuances that makes Instagram TV better for one thing and maybe YouTube better for another thing. I don't know. We will see when we come to that. So this is the end of the 3rd episode of the Baekdal Plus podcast. I hope you found it useful. Now, this podcast turned out to be quite long, and I would love to hear from you what you think about that. I could have split this podcast up into 2. I could have created one episode just about the fail expectations, and then created another episode just about the link tags. But let me know what you think. I would love to hear from you. And as always, remember to share this podcast. Everything that I do here, not just with this podcast, but also with everything else that I do, is only possible because of my subscribers. So please share this podcast with people you know and get them to subscribe, not just with this podcast, but even more so, get them to sign up for Baekdal Plus. It really helps. And as always, thank you for listening.
I'm just trying to get by. I don't know how you do it. Trying to keep you off my mind. I can't hold to it. You make it easy, but every time I fall back again. Tell me all the secrets, 'cause baby I can see the end. Don't slow down. I just need you to say you won't let go. I will keep my heart wide open. All I ask of you, baby, keep the fire burning. Come on, keep the fire burning. I keep losing track of time. I'm barely moving. Pick up the pieces left behind. I hold on to 'em. You make it easy, but every time I fall back again. Tell me all the secrets, 'cause baby I can't see the end. Don't slow down. I just need you to